Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, listeners. It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. And before you book a flight and pack a suitcase for summer travel, you might want to listen to this episode. Cameron Hewitt is a travel writer and photographer. And for the last 25 years, he's been a co-writer for Rick Steves' Europe, one of the biggest names in travel for guidebooks, public television and radio, and tours. Cameron joins us to talk about travel and climate change, how travelers can be more mindful and good citizens of the world, while also being prepared to contend with changing conditions, and how they're thinking about ways to grapple with the carbon footprint that comes with travel. Let's listen. Cameron Hewitt, welcome to Public Health on Call. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me.
We are so excited to talk to you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with for our audience?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been working with Rick Steves' Europe for about 25 years now, and a lot of you might know Rick Steves is one of the United States' most respected authorities on European travel. I'm the editorial and content director there, but that basically just means I get to travel a lot. I spend about 100 days a year in different parts of Europe. Mainly, I'm writing and researching and updating our guidebooks, but I've also worked as a tour guide, and I've also helped out some with Rick's public television show along the way.
Where's the most recent place you visited?
I just got back a couple weeks ago from a 3-week trip to Spain and Morocco.
Wonderful. Well, the topic today is actually a little bit outside of the norm of what we have been talking about on Public Health on Call, but we're thinking about travel. And, a lot of people might be planning some trips for the summer, particularly to Europe. But one of the other things that we talk about on this podcast a lot is things like climate change and being mindful of being kind of global citizens. So what are some ways that you've come across in your travels where people can hold these two things in mind?
Well, first of all, I think when you travel, it's a great opportunity to see the way that other people do things, other societies and cultures do things. And so one of the things I would say is one of the values of travel is that you get out into the world, you see the way that other societies are facing the same problems we are and coming up with creative solutions. I can think of a couple of recent on-the-ground examples. A trip I took to Venice about a year ago in the spring of 2024. There were two examples on that trip that really stood out to me. One is I was sitting on one of the islands of Venice waiting for my vaporetto to take me to the next island, and I bought a bottle of mineral water to go with my picnic lunch. And I unscrewed the cap, and the cap stayed on the bottle. And I kind of double-taked it and looked at it and looked it up. And sure enough, the European Union recently created legislation that all plastic bottles of a certain size have to have a tethered cap, which means the cap can't actually come off the bottle. And if you've traveled in Europe recently, you've experienced this. Sometimes it's a bit of a surprise. But it was a great example of how the European Union has kind of looked at the problem of environmental pollution. They're worried about little bottle caps that get lost and clog up the woodlands and waterways of Europe. And so there's a Europe-wide rule that you can't have that. And of course, not everyone loves it. Anytime there's a new policy, you have detractors and people say, well, this is such a pain. I will say it's been in place for about a year and a half now. And I think most Europeans are used to it. And even those who are at first against it are seeing the upsides. One thing is you don't always lose your bottle cap when you unscrew it. So I thought that was an interesting, European approach, something that I'm not sure would fly in the US or that it would even occur to us, but finding those creative solutions to some of these problems is really inspiring. The other example was also in Venice. I was traveling in April, and they were kind of having some unseasonably hot weather. And even though I was staying at several hotels that supposedly had air conditioning, I would show up at the hotel, and the air conditioning wasn't working. And I remembered, I'd run into this before in the spring and the fall, different countries, different municipalities have rules about when you can run the air conditioner. And in fact, I had to borrow a fan from the front desk in order to cool off at night. And it was, probably in the 70s, touching 80, which where I live in Seattle is a very hot weather. For Italians, that's not really that hot. They can deal with that all day long. And I even went into one of our recommended hotels in our guidebook to do our update. And the manager was sort of exasperated. He said, can you please explain to your American guests, because everyone's complaining about this, that in Venice, on April 15th, we have to turn off the heat, and we can't turn on the air conditioning until May 15th, unless there's a heat wave and the mayor decides it's an emergency enough that we're allowed to turn on the heat. And I thought, boy, what a strong contrast to the way a lot of Americans travel and consume energy when we travel. We're used to just any hotel we stay at, we crank up the AC to maximum, we turn our hotel room into a refrigerator car, and we leave it running all day long so it's nice and cool when we walk in the door. And Europeans are a lot more mindful about how they consume energy. And I will say that's really inspired me. When I'm back home now, I'm a lot less likely to crank up the air conditioning, or I'm more judicious about when I use the AC to cool off. If you've been to Europe, you probably know a lot of hotels there. To turn the power on to the room in the AC, you have to stick a card in the wall. If you pull your key card out to leave the room, it turns off all the power in your room. And that just kind of ties into this European sensibility of consuming energy thoughtfully.
So in other words, when people are thinking about their travels, they need to be mindful of maybe the different environmental considerations of the places that they're going to, and that Americans may approach these problems differently.
Be sensitive to the local norms to make sure you're traveling thoughtfully and as a temporary local, but also taking inspiration away from it. And I think we can have a conversation about the ethics of international travel when we know that it creates a huge carbon footprint. Though I believe that when you travel, you become a better global citizen. There's a lot of good takeaways from thoughtful travel. And one of them is you're exposed to these different ways of doing things, these creative solutions that might not have occurred to American lawmakers. And it brings you home as a more thoughtful voter who has a different way of looking at things that might even influence the way that you vote. And maybe you're more likely to support European-style policies that are more friendly to the environment.
Well, you brought up a big question here, which is I think a lot of people do think about that carbon footprint when they're traveling. And unfortunately, don't really have a lot of alternatives that don't involve getting on a plane to see the world. So how can we hold that and still be able to do the things that we love to do?
It's a very fair question. It's something that we've thought about deeply at Rick Steves Europe, and we're very aware. We pride ourselves on being a values-driven organization, and we just really believe that you want to travel thoughtfully in a way that's a net positive, I would say, not a net negative. And when you're leaving a huge carbon footprint of flying all the way across an ocean, you're starting off with a deficit, right? And so I think there's a variety of ways to look at it. One is, I would say, philosophically, if you're traveling purely for hedonism, if you're just going on vacation to have fun and zone out for a week, that's a reasonable way to travel. But I think there might be a more fair criticism of, is it really worth the carbon footprint? But we really teach thoughtful travel. We want people to be changed by their travel. So we believe in transformational travel. I work with a team of wonderful people who all really believe in this mission, that travel makes you a better person and a better citizen of the world. And so we look at that as a complicated trade-off. There's obviously sliders that you have to set, and all of this is a little bit of a rationalization. But I do think if you believe that travel is good for you and good for the world and can make you a smarter, more thoughtful citizen, then it's a good investment. We also have a program that we've innovated to try to respond to this. I can talk about that a little bit if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Right. A few years ago, we really wrestled with how to reckon with this honestly. And Rick, our CEO, Craig Davidson, our COO, really spent a lot of time thinking about how can we really realistically address this problem of climate change and the way we're contributing to it. They innovated this amazing program. I'm very proud to work for an organization that does this, called our Climate Smart Commitment. So every year for the past several years, we donate $1 million to a portfolio of causes that we've personally handpicked and work with to figure out creative ways to mitigate our carbon footprint. We looked at the idea of sort of traditional carbon offsets by protecting or planting trees, and I think there's different pros and cons, and a lot of people would say that's a really reasonable approach. In our case, we wanted to do something a little bit different. So we really focused on partnering with charities that do really important work, specifically in the developing world, in the poor world, the global south. Rick Steves a few years ago went and produced a TV show called Hunger and Hope, where he really investigated the underlying causes of global poverty. And so we thought, if we're going to try to have an impact on climate change, the people in these countries are the ones who are feeling the impacts of climate change the worst. And frankly, a lot of them, because they're very poor societies and it's sort of a subsistence model, are generating a lot of the carbon that's causing climate change. And so a lot of the charities that we work with are really targeting that particular problem, that particular challenge, helping improve the lives of the very poor people in our world while also addressing the root causes of climate change. Some of them are like forestry protection or reforestation efforts with organizations that we know well and trust. But some of them, I love some of the creativity behind this. Some of them are, for example, an organization that works with smallholder farmers to simply be more productive, to increase their yield while using fewer resources and increase their profits as well. Or my favorite example is, for example, a lot of these very poor places, people live and cook over an open fire within a house. So the smoke fills the space and it filters out through the roof. And it's very bad for the environment because it's very energy inefficient. They have to use a lot of firewood. A lot of that energy is wasted. And of course, the people living in that house have some pretty severe health impacts. And one of the programs that we've worked with helps build smart stoves in these homes. So they use less firewood. They have to spend less time collecting firewood, far more fuel and energy efficient, much fewer emissions compared to cooking the traditional way. And it's also better for the health and the longevity of the people living in that house. And so I think there's a number of ways to address this. But in the case of our organization, we've really tried to look creatively at how we can meaningfully address this and also do it in a way that really helps the people on our planet who need the most help.
And it sounds like something you'll continue to grapple with, of course, because there's no way to completely offset all of this.
Exactly. Yeah.
So another question for you. You mentioned before that part of the benefit of travel for Americans when they're thinking in this way is that they get exposed to all of these different solutions and ways of doing things that might be a little bit more environmentally minded. But travel, as we know, is a privilege. So what about people who maybe aren't exposed to these things by getting on a plane and flying to Spain? What are some ways that they can learn more about how this is being done in other places without actually having to travel?
You know, armchair travel is the next best thing to actual travel. And so I think you can look for documentaries, look for travelogues that help show you the way that different parts of the world are dealing with some of these problems. And I think just trying to be, regardless of how much you're actually able to leave our own country, try to think of yourself as a global citizen. That's something we're really talking a lot of. We've always held that very dearly, and we're talking a lot more about it recently. It's just really important for us to remember that we're just part of the family of nations. We're 4% of humanity. And a big goal of our approach to travel is teaching Americans to fit in a little bit better with the other 96% of humanity. Just keeping in mind that what happens here in the US, our environmental policies and all of our other policies have a big impact around the world. I think that you see that reflected in our approach to the climate smart commitment. How can we help people? Well, the first thing you think of when you think of climate change is not necessarily smallholder farmers in the global south, but we try to take a global view and be good global citizens and look out for the people who need the most help and so forth.
I really loved the examples that you shared at the top about some of the ways that Europe is contending with these different environmental problems, and tourism itself can create some environmental problems in these countries. What are some other creative things that you've seen with how municipalities have dealt with tourism?
Well, one thing we're hearing a lot about recently is over-tourism. This was becoming a problem before COVID, and then, of course, there was zero tourism or very little tourism. Now we're back to over-tourism, and it's becoming another big concern. A lot of municipalities, and that has all sorts of impacts, right? It has environmental impacts. It also just has quality of life impacts. Frankly, I think the people who living in a city that has over-tourism is not as worried about the environmental impact as the frustration of, I need to take my bus to work and there's 2 busloads worth of tourists ahead of me in line because I happen to work next to a major site, But I think what I'm seeing a lot of municipalities and countries even trying to do is encouraging travel, spreading around the demand, encouraging travel off season or in shoulder season. And we're doing that a lot as well on our end. We're looking at where we're taking travelers, where we're suggesting people to go, and really more and more encouraging, well, if you're going to the busiest place in Europe, at the busiest time of the day, at the busiest time of year, right? St. Mark's Square in Venice, mid-morning in the middle of May or September, you aren't really allowed to complain about the crowds, right? Because you're putting yourself in that situation. But you can go to the same place at a different time that's less crowded. The other thing is we're thinking more and more about alternative destinations to spread around the crowds. So even within a particular city, everyone goes to the same marquee sites. And sometimes there's some wonderful sort of undiscovered sites not that far away that are just as good and far less crowded. For example, if you're going to Rome and you want to go to the Colosseum, there's a huge line stretching in front of the Colosseum, and it's incredibly crowded inside. You can walk 10, 15 minutes to the Baths of Caracalla, which is another beautiful ancient Roman site. If you want to see Roman engineering, walk around the outside of the Colosseum and then go to the Baths of Caracalla and see how this enormous thermal bath complex was built using many of the same methods. And also looking at alternative destinations. So, people want to go to Amsterdam, for example. Amsterdam is very, very crowded. I was just there right after I was in Venice last year. And what I realized was it's crowded. It's also very expensive to stay right in the heart of Amsterdam. But what I realized is there's beautiful little Dutch towns that have all the same charm and quite a few less crowds, a very short train ride away. So you can stay in Haarlem, for example, which is a 20-minute train ride Leiden is a beautiful university town. It's about a half-hour train ride. Delft is a gorgeous town with canals just like Amsterdam and big, beautiful churches. Just about a 45, 50-minute train ride away. All of these are great options for maybe staying outside of Amsterdam if you want to do some sightseeing. Take this speedy train in, this very energy efficient and green train in, do your sightseeing, and then go back to a smaller town with less tourism impact.
So I'd like to leave us on a note of maybe some action. What are things that we can do as we think about going out in the world? What should we prepare? What should we bring with us? How can we be good, mindful travelers?
Well, I think one thing that I haven't touched on yet is maybe also being realistic about the reality that our climate is changing. And so one travel tip that I've been giving people is it's always important to be flexible when you travel. That's part of good travel. Now more than ever, you really have to be flexible and understand that the extreme weather that we're seeing in the US is affecting other places as well. And I think it's important to be mindful and thoughtful and anticipate the possibility of extreme weather in some of these places and be ready to change your plans if something happens. This has happened to me personally several times in the last few years. Last year I was in Germany about a week after there'd been severe floods along the Moselle River. I just missed it. I was literally in my hotel breakfast room in the cellar having breakfast, and they said, a week ago you would have been up to your neck in water. We had some severe floods. Just a few weeks ago I was in Spain going to Sevilla and Andalusia in southern Spain, and I was checking the news and saw they'd had some flooding even a week before I got there. By the time I got there, it was still raining, but it wasn't flooding. But you do have to be prepared for the fact that we're traveling in a time when extreme weather is affecting things. And be realistic. Keep an eye on the local news. It would be very easy not to know that this was happening. If you're going to be going somewhere, start watching the news. Also, it makes you a little bit of a more thoughtful, more informed, better global citizen as a traveler. And just be prepared to change plans. I've had to do this a couple of other times. Once I was going to New Zealand just as a cyclone was about to hit. And my wife and I actually changed plans and went to Australia for a couple of days to let that clear out and make sure everything was okay before we moved on to New Zealand. You don't want to be in the middle of all of this and adding to the problem if a country or a region is facing a crisis. So just be a thoughtful traveler, be realistic that this is a moving target these days, and be flexible.
Last question for you. Where are you headed next?
I'm leaving in just a couple of weeks. I'll be in North England for a couple of weeks and then on to Denmark.
Well, thank you so much, Cameron Hewitt, for joining us. This has been a great conversation, and we wish you the best in your travels.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Happy travels.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.